So happy to have you all here today. Those of you who are here in person, those of you who are joining us on Zoom. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff. I am the Senior Director of External Affairs here at the Museum of Idaho. And it is my great pleasure to, among other things, run the Museum Club Lecture Series. And really looking forward to today. As far as housekeeping goes, as usually, we will remind you to silence your phones. We have, for those of you who are here in person, we have refreshments. Please enjoy. For those of you who are at home, hopefully you brought your own. And so next time in 2 weeks, March 3rd is going to be our next session. And it's going to be our Genghis Khan behind the scenes exhibit tour with Chloe Doucette and Rod Hansen from right here at the museum. And that'll be a lot of fun. If you've never taken a tour with Chloe and Rod before, it's a real treat. They play off each other well. They know all sorts of fun stuff to throw in, and they can talk to you about what really goes into bringing these massive exhibits into and what we learn along the way. So we hope you'll enjoy, we hope you will join us for that. That one will not be broadcast or streamed. That will be an in-person experience only for understandable reasons, hopefully. So we hope you join us for that. And then for those of you who are Zoom only, we hope you'll join us next 2 weeks following that. We are going to be digging into our Wasden archaeological collection with Christina Franson here at the museum as well. An incredible archaeological collection that you all are going to be hearing a lot more about in the near future with any luck. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ari Goldstein. This was real fun to hear from Ari and to get to know him a little bit. I was just telling him, you know, my fear is always that we will at some point run out of great speakers, and yet that has not happened. That has not even close to happened. And sometimes they just come out of the woodwork from far away. And that's what we have here today. So Ari Goldstein is an expert on Jewish history in Idaho, which makes him one of a very small number, I suspect. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in Jewish history from Georgetown University, where he led an oral history project with the university's Jewish alumni and wrote an official history of the university's Jewish community. He has worked for the last 4 years at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, the first 2 as a project manager in the president's office, and the last 2 overseeing museum's public programs. So he is near and dear to us as a fellow museum-er. It's probably a better suffix than that. What was that? All right, good. There's two museums agree. He has served as a Glass Leadership Fellow at the Anti-Defamation League and a conference co-chair for the Council of American Jewish Museums. And he has studied Jewish history around the world, including in Ukraine, Poland, Israel, and Guatemala. We'll have to talk more about that. And his parents, here's the connection, live in Ketchum, not too far away, where he spent his summers growing up. And we will now turn the time over to Ari Goldstein for a history of Jews in Idaho.
Hi, everyone. How's my microphone placement? Fine? Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you. And thank you for the very kind introduction, Jeff. So we'll jump right in. Before I talk about what the history of Jews in Idaho is, I want to share a couple words with you about why I'm choosing to talk about this at all and why I feel this story is important. Idaho has always had one of the nation's smallest Jewish communities. Today, it's 0.1% of the state's population, which puts us just above South Dakota as the second smallest Jewish community in the country, above South Dakota, below Mississippi. But our small numbers obscure the fact that Jews have actually played an important role in the state's history. Pioneering Jewish merchants helped found several of the state's largest cities almost 150 years ago. So one of the goals of my project is to elevate the profile of Jews within Idaho's history. The other goal of this research project is to elevate the importance of Idaho within Jewish history. Because of the state's small Jewish community, it has been virtually ignored by historians of the American Jewish community. To this day, the only serious treatment of Idaho's Jewish history is a couple chapters in a 1973 book by a scholar of Mormon history who wrote about Jews by way of their interaction with Mormons in Idaho. So this is a story that hasn't really been told in a serious way, and I'm excited to help contribute to greater knowledge and understanding. And I think that the story of Idaho's Jews offers an interesting window into the story of Jews in the American West, which is an important part of the larger American Jewish story. So I'm telling this to you today and beyond the Museum of Idaho, both to elevate Jews within Idaho's history and to elevate Idaho within Jewish history. Now, briefly, just by way, I mean, you heard a little bit about me, but to clarify, I'm an independent researcher, not a historian. So as a museum person, I take that distinction seriously, and I'm calling this a history rather than the history of Jews in Idaho. I don't claim to have covered everything or researched every document in every archive in the state or talked to folks in every community, but I've put in a lot of work, and I think there's a really interesting, historically accurate story to tell, as well as a lot more that is yet to be discovered. As Jeff mentioned, I grew up spending summers and winters in Ketchum, and my parents have a place there, so I know that part of Idaho pretty well. And I've also studied and worked professionally in the field of Jewish history for 7 years. So as I have gotten to know Idaho, and I have my little Jewish history hat on, I recognize that actually there might be an interesting story here that I would have the capacity to tell. So I set out about a year and a half ago to research the question of how Jews got to Idaho, what we've done here, what kind of communities we've built here. And I should say we, when I say we in this case, I'm referring to Jews. I am Jewish. I'll also say we sometimes refer to Idaho or Idahoans. So the information that I'll present today comes from the research that I've done over the last year and a half at the Idaho State Archives in Boise, the Blaine County Historical Museum in Haley, the Community Library in Ketchum, a lot of online digitized historic newspapers, and a small number of oral histories with folks in the community. And that 1973 book by Juanita Brooks, which is interesting and worth looking at. So the project isn't yet done, but I'll present to you today what I found thus far, A History of Jews in Idaho. It's the first time I've talked about it to a public audience, so I very much welcome your feedback and also your questions and comments at the end. So I'm first going to talk about how Jews got to Idaho at the very beginning of Idaho's experience as a territory. And then we're going to do a deep dive into the story of the state's two oldest Jewish communities in Boise and the Wood River Valley, both of which offer pretty different Jewish Idahoan narratives. Then we'll talk about some of the other Jewish communities in the state, and then I'll share some concluding thoughts and patterns. So let's begin with these population statistic cards from 1878. These are a relic of the first systematic attempt ever made to count the Jewish population of the United States. Now, by way of understanding these cards, I should give a little bit of context on Jewish immigration to the United States. The first Jewish settlers came from Europe to the New World around 1650. So Jews were a part of American life from the very earliest days of the colonial era and the Republic. But historians generally speak about three distinct waves of Jewish immigration to the United States. And it's the second wave that's reflected in those cards, which we'll get back to in a moment. The first wave of immigration in the late 1600s and early 1700s was composed mostly of Sephardic Jews from Spanish and Portuguese-speaking lands. They built thriving Jewish communities in places like Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but they did not make their way into the American interior. I think you all can envision what Idaho was like in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The second wave of immigration was German Jews who came in the 1840s and 50s. Jews left Germany because of persecution and political upheaval. And during this period, there was an almost 100-fold increase in the United States' Jewish population from some 3,000 in 1820 to 300,000 in 1880. So it was a transformation of American Jewish life. And these are the Jews who settled the American West in the middle and end of the 19th century, and who are reflected in those population cards. The third wave of Jewish immigration came from places like Russia and Poland in Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924. This was by far the largest wave. More than 2 million Eastern European Jews emigrated to the US during that 40-year period, including my great-grandparents. They also made their way west and reshaped once again the communities that German Jews had settled a couple of decades earlier. So, so the German Jews who arrived in the middle of the 1800s arrived in a moment of westward expansion, which is why they were the ones to settle the American West, and a great promise on the frontier, not just for Jews, but for many Americans who were settling in the East. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, and as you may know, in 1860 in Idaho. So prospectors showed up here shortly thereafter, and in 1863, President Lincoln formally established the Idaho Territory. The first recorded Jew in the territory was Joseph D. Farmer, who braved a gold rush trail from Boise to a place called Call's Fort in January 1864, a month after Idaho became a territory. There were likely other Jews who came that year or in the couple years before it, although we are limited sometimes with what kind of records we have about people's religious identity. Some Jews likely came as miners, some as merchants, some with the army protecting the wagon trails that were moving westward. Several dozen Jews actually settled within Idaho in the 1860s and 70s, and almost all of them were German immigrants who had arrived on the East Coast and then made their way westward. Most of the Jews who came in this very early wave settled in two places, Boise and Idaho City, which is not that far from Boise. So this letter was written in 1865 from someone in Idaho City who signs off as a son of Israel, and he is describing what his Jewish life is like in Idaho. It's the first piece of evidence we have about Jewish settlement in the state. In this letter, he references 4 other Jewish friends of his, and he describes celebrating the Jewish high holidays together. Others settled outside of Boise and Idaho City in much more isolated, scattered outposts around the state, often pursuing news of gold discoveries in places like the Clearwater Valley or along the Salmon River. Life was pretty lonely for the Jews that settled in those outposts and may not have had anyone who shared their identity. Another young man, besides this one, he lived in an isolated outpost at Silver City. And in 1873, he placed an advertisement in a national Jewish newspaper called The Israelite. And he said, a young co-religionist doing a large business in the wilds of Idaho would like to form the acquaintance of some young lady, and therefore politely requests correspondence. And that was read by Jews around the country. So it was around this time, after this great wave of German Jewish immigration and the beginnings of Jewish settlement in the West, that national Jewish leaders in Philadelphia decided to embark upon an effort to statistically measure the Jewish population of the United States, which had never been done. So in 1877, acting under the auspices of the Board of Delegates of American Israelites, a guy named David Sulzberger mailed cards like this out to every county in America and asked the locals to report back with how many Jews lived in their county, and if there was a formal congregation, some features of the congregation. Today, the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati has 7 of these population postcards sent from Idaho back to David Sulzberger in Philadelphia. And we can learn from these that in 1878, there were 85 Jews in the Idaho Territory. That included 15 in Idaho City, 4 in Alturas County, 6 in Silver City, 3 in Washington, Idaho, and 14 in Oneida, Idaho. Now, if you look at them close up, you can learn other things besides numbers. For example, each of the cards is signed by someone in that county, and they all have German names. L. Heidelberger, Saul Neuhauser, Louis Kohn, Meyer Kohn. I particularly like this card, which says in a scrawled script, by request of Mrs. Eckstein, wish to state that he is dead over a year ago, and furthermore, he was no Jew. So I guess they didn't always send it to the correct people. The most valuable card in this archives in Cincinnati is actually not a card, but a larger piece of paper sent from George Spiegel in Boise back to Philadelphia. And he reported that Boise had 34 Jews in 1878, by far the largest concentration in the state, more than twice the size of the next largest group in Idaho City. So this brings us to the story of Boise. I mentioned we're going to do a deep dive on Boise and then the Wood River Valley, which are pretty different kinds of Jewish communities. Now we'll jump into Boise and try to sketch a profile of who these 34 Jews were and what kind of community they built. So in the 1860s, Boise quickly became the largest city in the territory of Idaho. Here it is in 1890 with a population of a few thousand people. As I've already mentioned, some of the state's first Jewish settlers arrived here. Although some were miners and some came with the army, the significant majority of the state's early Jewish settlers were merchants, selling things like dry goods, clothing, and furniture. And that's a trend that's true in small towns across the American West and South. The story of one Jewish family helps illustrate the larger story of Jews who settled in Boise. These are three brothers from Bavaria, Germany: Nathan, David, and Sigmund Falk. David, who's on the left, came from Bavaria to the US in 1850, right in the middle of that great wave of immigration. He clerked at a store in New Hampshire, and then in 1859, sailed down to Panama, crossed the isthmus, sailed up, lived in Oregon for a few years, and once he heard about gold in Idaho, made his way inland to Boise. So he arrived in Boise in 1864, and the next year opened a shop in Boise with someone named Joseph Alexander. His brother Nathan, in the middle, who was 10 years his junior, came to the US in 1864 and immediately joined his brother David in Boise, first as a clerk in David's shop and then as a business partner. And in 1868, the two brothers opened a new mercantile establishment on Boise's Main Street under the name David Falk and Brothers. It's a pretty homespun operation. They were using a wheelbarrow for delivering goods in the early years. But trade grew steadily, and in 1873, they were joined by their third brother, Sigmund Falk. Their business grew into one of the largest in Boise, called Falk Mercantile Company. Here's an image of an undated image of the Falk building in Boise. You can get a sense from the grandeur of the building about their business success. So in 1878, the year of that census, the three Falk brothers were among the 34 Jews that made up Boise's Jewish community. Out of a total population of 1,900 people in the city, Jews made up about 2%, small, but enough to have a real community. The Falks were typical German Jews, highly assimilated and relatively secular in their religious observance, but connected nonetheless to their Jewish identity. In Bavaria, their economic and social opportunities would have been highly restricted because of their religion, but they experienced a profound change in status when they crossed the Atlantic and came to the United States, where their whiteness allowed them to blend in. In a land premised upon individualism and the invisibility of religious difference, the Falks were given the opportunity to forge their own identity, and they took advantage of that to become leading businessmen in, of all places, Boise, Idaho. Despite being highly assimilated, they still identified as Jewish. And in the 1890s, the three Falk brothers came together with the other Jews of Boise with the intention of establishing a formal Jewish congregation, a place that they could pray and learn together. So in perhaps the most famous date in the history of Idaho Jewry, the Falks and a group of 24 other Jewish men came together on February 17, 1895. That is exactly 127 years ago today. A nice coincidence. We didn't plan this talk with that in mind. And they came together in a living room and drew up bylaws for a reform congregation that they called Beth Israel, or House of Israel. They planned to buy property, build a synagogue, establish a Jewish cemetery next to the synagogue, and create an infrastructure for charity and communal support. The next year, this building opened. It was designed to look like a Moorish-style synagogue from Spain, but they incorporated Boise sandstone into the building in a physical representation of the city's Jewish community, which was full of immigrants and very international at the same time as it was firmly rooted in southern Idaho. So once the synagogue opened, it became the physical home of Boise's suddenly growing Jewish community, which we'll get to. But the story of Congregation Beth Israel would not be complete without the story of Moses Alexander. Like the Falks, Alexander was born in Germany and emigrated to the United States, spending time first in the East and finding his way to Boise by 1891. He quickly became a leading man in town, and in 1895, it was in his living room that the meeting to establish Congregation Beth Israel took place. He also led the fundraising campaign for the construction of the new synagogue. In 1897, Alexander was elected mayor of Boise, and in 1914, governor of the state of Idaho as a Democrat. Two men of Jewish ancestry had served as governors of other states, but they were both practicing Christians. So Moses Alexander was the first self-identified Jewish person to be the governor of any US state, a distinction that still brings great pride to Idaho's small Jewish community. It was a testament to the relative tolerance of the American frontier that Alexander was able to achieve such success. Of course, Boise was not a particularly welcoming place in 1897 for African Americans or Native Americans, but for Jews, it was uniquely tolerant, far away from the ingrained prejudices and social structures of the Eastern Seaboard, and certainly from the anti-Semitism in Europe that many of these men escaped. Alexander was not the only Jewish politician to find success in Boise. Another Jewish immigrant merchant named Charles Himrod served as mayor before him in the 1870s, and in the 1910s, Max Mayfield and Leo Greenbaum served on Boise's city council. So Alexander, Himrod, Mayfield, and Greenbaum were all part of this German Jewish immigrant wave. But I mentioned earlier that a much larger wave of Eastern European Jews came around the turn of the 20th century. Unlike the German Jews who came earlier, Eastern European Jews were poorer and they were much more religious. And they almost all came through the Immigration Processing Center at Ellis Island, which opened in 1892. They quickly overcrowded dense neighborhoods like New York's Lower East Side, so Jewish organizations began devising plans to resettle the new immigrants further west and help them obtain well-paying jobs and assimilate them culturally and economically. In 1903, when Moses Alexander was serving as mayor of Boise, he received a letter from one of those Jewish organizations in New York and said, "The immigration of our people into this country is gradually increasing at an alarming rate, and extraordinary efforts must be made on the part of all Jewish communities to cooperate with us in order to meet this problem manfully. May we therefore ask you to be so kind as to let us know what you can do for us. That is to say, how many Jewish families you can take at the present time for whom there is promise of independence and self-support." As mayor of Boise, Alexander agreed to take in 17 Jewish immigrants from New York and resettle them in Boise's Jewish community, which, even though it was a small number, reshaped the character of the city's community. As more arrivals came from Eastern Europe and settled Boise, they found that Congregation Beth Israel, which was very German in character, didn't suit their interests and wasn't religious enough. So they established in 1912 a second synagogue in Boise named Congregation Ahavath Israel, which followed Orthodox Jewish rituals. So this letter from 1913, sent once again from Boise to Jewish leaders in the East, attests to the presence of two synagogues in the city, one Reformed and one Orthodox, and a community of about 50 Jewish families, which was at this point just under 1% of the city's population. In 1913, the community was much larger than it had been just a couple decades earlier, and we can see on this questionnaire that kosher meat was easily obtained. This is Congregation Ahavath Beth Israel today. Boise's two synagogues, Beth Israel and Ahavath Israel, merged in 1986 and now operate out of the same historic structure that opened in 1896. Actually, the oldest continuously used synagogue west of the Mississippi River. The community didn't hire its first rabbi until the 1980s, but they've now been served by Rabbi Dan Fink since 1994. And descendants of the Falk brothers and of Governor Moses Alexander are still active participants in the synagogue community, which has about 250 active families. So Boise is emblematic of one type of Jewish community, a mining town that popped up, grew early, and continued to thrive basically until today. Similar examples of Jewish communities with a profile like Boise are those in Denver and Salt Lake City. It's a very different kind of story than what happened in the Wood River Valley, which we'll turn to now. So just like Boise, the towns in the Wood River Valley sprang up overnight as a result of mining fever. In this case, David Ketchum discovered silver and lead deposits in 1879 near Galena Summit, just north of Ketchum. News of the discoveries traveled fast, attracting first prospectors and then merchants from across the American West. And in 1880, three major towns were established in the Wood River Valley: Haley, Ketchum, and Bellevue. By 1882, Haley boasted a population of 2,700 people living in 75 buildings and hundreds of tents, which were set on a town site of 140 blocks. This map is from 1884, and by this year, the local sheriff had issued 18 saloon licenses and 12 gambling licenses for the new mining town. Just like in Boise, Jews were among the very first merchants to arrive in Haley, Ketchum, and Bellevue, and more followed as the valley continued to boom throughout the 1880s. My research from newspaper and census records has confirmed that during that decade, at least 37 Jewish adults lived or worked in the Wood River Valley, and at least 7 Jewish children were born or raised in the area. It's likely that there were other Jews in the valley at that time who I haven't been able to confirm as Jewish through records, or whose presence has been lost to history because their stay was short. So the individual stories of some of these early merchants in the Wood River Valley are revealing, just like they were in Boise. So let me get into a couple of them. Let's start with S.J. Friedman and his wife, Lusha Meyer. They were both German immigrants who arrived in the US in the mid-1800s. S.J., his name was Simon J. Friedman, he went by S.J., arrived in Haley in 1881, and he set up a 20 by 40-foot tent to sell dry goods, clothing, and boots to miners. That fall, he erected a permanent store, which you can see in this image, in place of his tent. And as the town's Jewish population grew over the next couple of years, S.J. became its unofficial leader, running Jewish religious services in his living room and on special occasions in social halls in Haley. In his home, S.J. owned and kept the community's ritual objects, including prayer books, mezuzot, which go on Jewish doorposts, and Kiddush cups from which we drink wine. He went down to Salt Lake City, which was a much larger Jewish community, to find a wife, and in 1886 brought Lusha Meyer Friedman back to Haley with him and had 4 Jewish kids in the Wood River Valley. Like the Fox and Boise, S.J. Friedman was very open about his Jewish identity. He would place advertisements in the local newspaper whenever he was planning to close his store for a Jewish holiday so that his non-Jewish patrons would know. But also like the Fox, he became a respected merchant and leader in Haley. S.J.'s cousin, Simon Moses Friedman, who went by SM, accompanied S.J. from Germany to the United States in 1869 and later followed him to Haley in the middle of the 1880s. He started as a sheep and cattle rancher, but eventually opened a store right next to his cousins. Now, when the village of Haley formally incorporated in 1903, Simon Moses joined the village's board of trustees. Then he became chairman of the board. And when the village turned into a city of Haley, S.M. Friedman was elected its first mayor in 1911. And then he was reelected to a second term in 1913. So through different forms of government, Simon Moses Friedman was Haley's chief executive for 7 years, from 1907 to 1913, a role in which he established the city's first water supply. He was proudly Jewish, but his daughter Lucille said this about him. He always felt that everybody here was an American citizen. Since he was rescued from Germany, he should get down and kiss the soil of the United States. They should be so grateful to be an American citizen. So he felt that you had great responsibility to your country and that you should be active in doing things. Even though few have written about Idaho's Jewish history, there are interesting books out there about the experience of Jews in the American West. And I'll quote for you right now something briefly from Sherry Rabin, author of Jews on the Frontier, which describes very well the experience of the Friedman family in Haley. The relationship between Judaism and mobility, writes Rabin, was a fraught one that occasioned debate and inspired adaptations. Jews in places like Boise or Haley did things like eat non-kosher beef, but not pork, eschew congregational membership, but still stay in a Jewish boarding house, or marry a non-Jewish woman, but insist that their kids would still be Jewish. They worked to create stable identities and lives on their own through new institutions, ideologies, and movements. They were not eager assimilationists, not adamant reformers, and not staunch traditionalists, but rather ordinary Jews who were flexible, open-minded, and pragmatic, which you had to be in frontier towns like Haley. So up until the 1950s, the 2 Friedman stores still occupied marquee spots on Haley's main street, run by Simon J. and Simon Moses's children. And in 1931, the Friedman children donated land to the city of Haley to build the first airport in the Wood River Valley, which today is called Friedman Memorial Airport in Haley. Outside of Israel, I have not been able to find evidence of any airport in the world named for a Jewish person besides Friedman Memorial Airport. Another nice distinction for our small Jewish community in Idaho. We'll move on to a couple other brief stories. Aaron Morris was a Jewish immigrant who arrived in Haley in 1883. He ran a grain business with his cousin named Isidore Morris. And then in a dramatic and sad moment, in August 1884, he was riding his horse from Ketchum to Haley in the middle of the night and was shot dead. Since news and gossip traveled quickly in the small valley, the story of Morris's sensational murder became a local obsession for several weeks. His cousin Isidore offered a $1,000 reward for the apprehension and conviction of the murderer. His body was eventually taken to Salt Lake City, the location of the nearest Jewish cemetery, and given a proper Jewish burial. Leopold Wertheimer was another leading Jewish merchant in Haley and a generous philanthropist. He ran a men's clothing and furnishing store, which you can see here, and a bank. And when he died in 1913, the Wood River Times reported that 25 sleighs carrying 4 to 10 mourners each accompanying his body to the local cemetery. So he was buried in Haley, not in Salt Lake City. The newspaper said, but for the snowstorm which lasted all day, the attendance would have been the largest at any funeral seen in Wood River. As a mark of respect, the bank, public offices, and a majority of public businesses were closed from noon until after the funeral. When Wertheimer died, he left an estate of considerably more than $100,000, which is about $3 million in today's money, to local charitable endeavors, including a $1,000 donation to the city of Haley to refurbish an area that was being used as a horse racing track. And that part of the city is called Wertheimer Park today in gratitude for his generosity. Here's just a little display of different ads in local newspapers throughout the 1880s from Jewish merchants, showing you the breadth of professions that they held and roles that they played in the town. And these are the names of those 37 plus people who are believed to be Jewish who lived in the Wood River Valley in the 1880s. Now, if the valley had continued to prosper past the 1880s, this group of people might have grown their ranks, and by the 1890s, sat down in a living room and established a synagogue, just like their peers in Boise had done. But the Wood River Valley's story took a different turn, and bust followed boom. The price of silver dropped, and a national collapse in the silver market in 1893 virtually emptied out the Wood River Valley. Compounding the silver depression were constant fires, including a major fire that wiped out almost all of Haley's business district in 1889. This photo from 1935 illustrates the kind of devastation that fires could cause in towns made of wood. Incidentally, S.J. Friedman, whose story you saw earlier, had chosen to pack a foot of dirt underneath his roof, and legend goes that his building was the only one that made it through the Great Fire of 1889 because of his brilliant architectural planning. And that when he was barricaded inside, he also had metal shutters on the outside rather than wood. So he barricaded himself inside during the fire, and when the fire was over, he walked outside and said, "Gosh, the old synagogue still stands." Of course, it was a store, not a synagogue, but you get a sense of his identity. So after the silver bust and the fires, mining virtually stopped. The miners left, the merchants left, and the Wood River Valley turned into a very sleepy sheep ranching valley in the early 20th century. Most of the valley's Jews, except the Friedmans, moved elsewhere, and the remaining ones who were left either converted or assimilated into Christianity. 2 of the Friedman kids kept their Jewish identities, but never married and died in the middle of the 20th century, taking with them any memory of this once vibrant Jewish community in the mining town. By the early 20th century, there really was no longer a Jewish community at all in the Wood River Valley. And in this way, it's a very different story from Boise, but it's actually a common one across the American West. As you guys know, dozens of communities boomed and then busted during the mining era, and Jews, like many other communities of people, boomed and busted in these towns, created communities, and then abandoned those communities according to the same cycles. But what distinguishes the Wood River Valley is a complete rebirth in the mid-20th century, not because of mining or ranching, but because of skiing. Here we see Averil Harriman and an Austrian count named Felix Schafgotsch, who established the nation's first destination ski resort, which they named Sun Valley, in 1936. From the earliest days of the resort, Jewish businessmen and especially Jewish Hollywood actors and producers were very involved in the resort and in making it a success. The resort grew in the 1950s and 60s, and Jews started to visit from around the country to enjoy the skiing, as many people did. Here's one example of a Jewish family skiing in Sun Valley in 1961. As time went on, many of these Jewish visitors bought houses in the Wood River Valley, then became part-time residents and eventually full-time residents, and started to build a community. By the 1980s, there were once again several dozen Jews in the Wood River Valley for the first time since the 1880s. And they started celebrating holidays together and holding services in living rooms. And in 1983, they formally incorporated as the Wood River Jewish Community, also called by some Temple Beth Baldy after Bald Mountain, the ski mountain in Sun Valley. Now, this was not an extension whatsoever of the Jewish community that had existed in the same location a century earlier. It was a completely new community that developed on the same location, founded from nothing by new people. Like the community of 1880s, the community of the 1980s was highly diverse, with Jewish residents coming from all over the country and bringing with them their own customs and practices. And like the one of the 1880s, it was highly reformed, meaning secular in its religious observance. But unlike the earlier community, the newer community in the Wood River Valley was made up of Americans rather than immigrants in large part, and it was primarily led by women rather than men who were organizing Jewish rituals at home. Today, in 2022, the Wood River Valley is a thriving Jewish community of almost 200 families, including my own, and our own part-time rabbi named Robbie Sherwin, who you can see on the right at the annual Trailing of the Sheep Festival in Ketchum. And in 2021, the Wood River Jewish community achieved the major milestone of buying a building, which is currently being renovated to become the first ever synagogue in central Idaho, slated to open this fall. So if the Boise story represents a Jewish community that popped up in the mining days and then continued to grow until the present, like Denver or Salt Lake City, the Wood River Valley represents 2 distinct types of Idaho Jewish stories. One of a mining town that had boom and bust and disappearance, and a second of resort communities that have attracted Jews at the end of the 20th century. And in that way, the newer Wood River Valley story is similar to the stories of the Jewish communities that have grown in Aspen, Jackson Hole, Park City, and places like that. So we've done a deep dive in 2 places, but I do want to mention some of the other Jewish communities around the state. The next largest is in Pocatello. And in 1915, Jews in Pocatello began praying together, and in 1924, established a formal congregation named Temple Emmanuel. And then they built this building in 1960. This is currently the only synagogue in the state outside of Boise, which will be joined by the Wood River Valley one shortly. They do not have a rabbi, so it's led by congregants. One interesting chapter in the Pocatello Jewish story is the role of Leonard Greenberg, a US Army chaplain who was based in Pocatello during World War II and oversaw Jewish religious observance for all soldiers that were stationed throughout Utah and Idaho. He was the only Jewish chaplain for hundreds of miles. This letter from 1945 survives as a description of what it was like for Greenberg. He complains about, quote, the tremendous distances between towns, the immense area to be serviced, the complete isolation, and the almost complete absence of Jewish facilities, end quote. But he also says he loved his assignment and the ability to create community amongst men of diverse Jewish backgrounds who were all stationed here. So that's Pocatello. In Twin Falls, congregation Beth Chavarim, which doesn't have a building but is a formal congregation, was established in the last few decades and is led by Rabbi Tony Prater. Today, the Twin Falls Jewish community has about 100 active families. Rather, 100 members, not families. Up in Moscow, Idaho, there's a small group that gathers without a formal congregation, building a rabbi based around the University of Idaho. Sometimes they go by the Jews of the Palouse. And then some Jews who live along the borders of Idaho are affiliated with communities outside the state. So Jews in the northeast corner will be involved in the Jackson Hole Jewish community, and Jews up near Coeur d'Alene are often involved in the Spokane, Washington Jewish community. In Boise, which I've circled again here, there's also a new Jewish presence, a Chabad center that opened about 15 years ago. Chabad is a global Jewish movement based in New York that has chapters all over the world. So the Chabad is a separate entity from the historic synagogue in Boise. As Idaho has grown in recent years, and especially during COVID, so have Jewish communities. I know that our community in the Wood River Valley has added many new families over the past couple of years. So it's an exciting moment. Now, that is not the history, as I mentioned. It's a history of Jews in Idaho, but it's one that hasn't been told before and that I think is valuable. I mentioned at the beginning that one of my goals was to elevate the profile of Jews within Idaho's history. I think this history does that by showcasing the fact that Jews were founding merchants in cities and towns across the state, including the capital, and Jews have served as city council members, postmasters, state assembly members, mayors, and governors since the earliest days of the Idaho Territory. Despite making up a minute percentage of the state's population, Jews have been overrepresented among the state's leaders, and Jews were a core part of the patchwork of American pioneers that established the state and helped lead it to prosperity in its early days. From the story of Jews, we also understand a couple essential facts about Idaho's early history, including the relative diversity and tolerance of its mining towns, and the promise offered by the American West to people in Europe who had been beat down by racist discrimination. My other goal was to elevate the profile of Idaho within Jewish history. Most Jews live on the coasts and they pay little attention to the history of a community as small as ours. But Idaho was home to the nation's first practicing Jewish governor and its only airport named for a Jewish person, as I mentioned. And more importantly, the story of Idaho's Jews offers a valuable window into the experiences of Jews in the American West. From the story of Idaho, we can learn about the divergent ways that Jewish immigrants in places where there weren't a lot of people like them navigated the pressure of assimilation and a lack of Jewish infrastructure. How some chose to pursue a life of faith in living rooms, others chose to develop a new social or cultural Judaism that lacked religious observance, and still others converted or married out of the faith entirely. One of the reasons why Idaho has been ignored by American Jewish historians, in addition to its small size, or rather not by historians, one of the reasons why it's ignored by many American Jews is because it's associated with anti-Semitism, with the Ku Klux Klan that thrived in southern Idaho in the 1920s, with the German and Austrian Nazis who helped found the Sun Valley Resort in the 1930s, and of course, with the white supremacist Aryan nations later in the 20th century. To many of those on the outside, Jewish citizenship in Idaho seems tenuous and under threat. To those of us on the inside, there's nothing more natural than the story of being Jewish in Idaho, a persecuted people chasing opportunity and liberty in the American West, building our own institutions where there were none, becoming leading business people, elected officials, and philanthropists, and holding onto our identity through challenge and change. Today, 187 years to the date after Jewish merchants in Boise gathered to establish a synagogue, mere months before Jews in the Wood River Valley will open their own, Jews in Idaho are thriving. So thank you for letting me tell part of the story to you today, and I'd be delighted to hear your own perspectives and answer any questions you might have. 5 questions? Okay, great. Yeah, Chloe. Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Chloe, who's asking about the importance of gender roles in the different Jewish communities over time. I'll say a couple things. Any of us who have researched history know that oftentimes women who did important things a long time ago weren't written about. So Jewish women may have played a larger role than I can understand in the 1880s, but did not get included in the local newspapers and therefore didn't get included in my research. But it's certainly the men who are highlighted when Jewish events were written about. And given the way that Judaism, like many religions, functions, it's likely that it would have been men who were the types of people that would found a synagogue or play leading roles in a religious environment in the 19th century. I think that the fact that it was women who led the rebirth of the Wood River Jewish community in the 1980s is probably a function more of changing gender roles in American society than anything, but it also sort of makes sense if women are the ones who are often keeping the home. They may also have the strongest networks with other Jewish women in the community, that they would come together and start ritual observance. I'll also say that a lot of, when you don't have a synagogue and you just have informal Jewish practice in homes, a lot of it revolves around food. You're cooking meals for a Passover Seder or a Hanukkah meal or something for Rosh Hashanah. So that was part of people coming together. There were in the Wood River Valley, at least there was one of the earliest Jewish couples to settle in the 1950s was 2 Holocaust survivors, named Helen and Ben Goldberg. And when I've spoken to people who came to the Valley in the 70s and the 80s, everyone says, oh my God, the first person I met was Helen Goldberg. I asked if there were any Jews in town and everybody sent me to her. And her husband, Ben, ran a jewelry shop where Helen often was. So people would walk into the jewelry shop and say, hey, I'm Jewish, I just moved here. Is there anything going on? And in lots of small Jewish communities, like any type of small community, that happens. We have people who are sort of appointed the ambassadors and they help bring a lot of others in. Yeah.
About how but talk about the distinction between why some of the congregations in Idaho have been attended by rabbis and others.
Okay, so the question was about why some congregations in Idaho have rabbis and others don't. You don't need a rabbi in order to pray if you're a Jew. You need a group of 10 Jewish people to come together. It's called a minyan, and then that's a sufficient quorum to embark upon any form of prayer. But it's better to have a rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. So rabbis in the Jewish faith are not closer to God, but they are more learned and they can help teach others how to pray, how to relate in community. They're also community leaders in addition to teachers. So they might be the ones that are actually putting in the work to organize things and lead rituals. Often rabbis know Hebrew and can read the prayers, and some members of the community might not. So I would say, without putting words into anyone's mouth, that probably every community in the state would like to have a rabbi if they can afford it or they have enough members to sustain it. But in places like Idaho, sometimes those things can be a challenge. So the fact that in the Wood River Jewish community, we now have a permanent part-time rabbi and a synagogue is a reflection of the community's greater size and greater financial strength than in previous years. Do you have a question as well? Mm-hmm. What's the INL? Apologies. So the question, which I'll repeat for those on Zoom, was given the Idaho National Laboratory in Idaho Falls, it's surprising that there isn't a bigger Jewish community. Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I have a good explanation for it. I'm certain that there are Jewish people in Idaho Falls, but it takes a lot of work to start a community. You have to find people who are also Jewish, they have to have the interest to participate. You need to raise money and organize events. So hopefully it will happen someday. Certainly, Jews here have the option of going down to the community in Pocatello, or maybe if they live north of here, participating in the one in Jackson Hole. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, so the question was about the founders of the Sun Valley Resort. Averell Harriman, who was the chairman of the Union Pacific Railroad, is the visionary who founded the resort, but there was no destination ski resorts in the US at the time, and the best skiers in the world were in Germany and Austria, so he turned to an Austrian count, brought him over to the US and asked him to travel around the rail lines and find the most optimal location in order to build a ski resort. So he traveled to the places that are now Vail and Aspen and other resorts, and he discounted them, and he ended up in Sun Valley and wired back to Harriman and said, I think I found the perfect location. So Harriman went out to visit, they toured it together and decided to establish the resort. And beyond just Count Schafgotsch, they turned also to Germans and Austrians for all of the ski instructors who helped set up the first ski school and found the resort. Yes. The question was about Harriman State Park in Idaho, which I would imagine is definitely named for Averell Harriman, who's has a great legacy in the West. Yeah. So the question is about, it's an important question about anti-Semitic attitudes. Sometimes when we're researching, we find explicit evidence, and sometimes we can infer and make judgments. I was very curious in these mining towns in the early days that there was anti-Semitism, but all these Jewish merchants were posting in the newspaper that they were Jewish. There would be an article in the newspaper about them celebrating Jewish holidays together, and they were the most respected merchants in town, and they were elected to positions like mayor. So I infer from all of those facts, they were pretty accepted in the early days. There was a robust KKK in Idaho in the 1820s. They came very close to taking over the Twin Falls city government in 1924, and they were adamantly anti-Semitic in addition to being anti-Catholic and anti-Black. So I imagine for the few Jews living in Idaho in the 20s, that was a unnerving experience. One of the things I looked into was whether the Germans and Austrians in Sun Valley had Nazi ties and whether that might have impacted the Jews who were in the area. The short answer, they did have Nazi ties, but there weren't really any Jews in the area yet in the 30s because a lot had left and more hadn't come yet. And then I think that given that the white supremacist activity in the 80s happened in northern Idaho, where there's a smaller Jewish community, again, the direct interaction between, let's say, Jews and anti-Semites was minimal. But yeah, it has existed in Idaho, like it has across the US, and I think we'll never eradicate it. But as I said earlier, this was a place, unlike big cities in the East, that didn't have there's different strains of anti-Semitism. One of the strains of anti-Semitism that Jews in the East dealt with was Catholic anti-Semitism. Another one was the old Protestant anti-Semitism, sort of an exclusivity of that Jews couldn't be part of social clubs and or part of professional establishments that were dominated by Protestants. None of that existed in Idaho. It was the Wild West. It was, you proved yourself whether you could mine well or be a good merchant. So even though there was anti-Semitism, I think it also offered great promise. Yeah. Yes, so the question was about clarifying Jewish population statistics in the state today. I'll give you numbers, but I'll also say that they're not particularly good numbers. The census doesn't ask for religious affiliation. The American Jewish Committee is the entity that keeps the closest track, but they still basically do that tactic from 1878 where they reach out to synagogues and they say how many people live in your city, and and then they compile the numbers and put forth an estimate. In addition, nowadays, so many Americans of all faiths are sort of unaffiliated, or you might have parents of mixed religions, and you might not choose to answer the survey or belong to a synagogue, so it's muddled. The AJC says that there are a little bit over 2,000 Jews in the state of Idaho. Most of those are in the Boise area. The Boise Synagogue says that they have 250 families. The Wood River Jewish Community says it has 200 families. The Twin Falls Jewish Community says it has 100 people, not families, and they don't have clear numbers in Pocatello or up in Moscow. Yeah.
Talk about the third wave
Mhm. So the question is about this third wave of emigration of Jews, the 2 million who came between 1880 and 1924. Yes, there was in the Russian Empire in particular, there was a great increase in state-sanctioned anti-Semitism and in pogroms, which were like violent raids of Jewish towns that motivated people to leave. That was combined with the sense that there was more economic opportunity in addition to less anti-Semitism in the United States. And I would say because of increased communication infrastructure as time went on, people could envision themselves moving around the world by 1910 when maybe they wouldn't have been considered that in 1810. I actually just, my great-grandmother was born in Odessa, which was a part of the Russian Empire, and I actually just was reading her autobiography recently. She's now passed away, but she wrote about, in 1906, a pogrom in her town, which she wrote, the Tsar was coming to town and they knew that all the Jews were going to be shot, which is a child's understanding of what was happening, but they had to hide in a neighbor's attic for 3 days before they were allowed outside. And when they got back outside, their grocery store had been ransacked and people they knew had been killed. And that's when my family decided to leave Odessa and emigrate to the United States. And within a couple of years, they landed in Ellis Island and then made their way to California, where I grew up. Yes. Mm-hmm. So this question is about the first wave of Jewish immigrants. So Spain and Portugal were in the Middle Ages the global epicenters of Jewish life. But in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella launched the Spanish Inquisition, which made it punishable by death to be Jewish. Huge numbers of Jews at the end of the 1400s, the beginning of the 1500s, left Spain, and Portugal also had an Inquisition. And they settled all across Europe and Ottoman lands, and out in Brazil and some of the colonies that were at that point just beginning in the New World. So you had ethnically Spanish and Portuguese Jews who spoke Spanish and Portuguese who suddenly lived all over the world. So they may not have immigrated from Iberia, but from other places. In the first group of Jews to arrive in the US that had made their way from Portugal to Brazil under false Christian identities. Brazil was then taken over by Holland. They started practicing openly as Jews again. Then Portugal retook Brazil from Holland. They suddenly were under threat as Jews, so they left Brazil and moved to New York City in 1649. It was a group of 23 Jews that arrived and founded New York's Jewish community. So now we think of most Jews as white and from Eastern Europe, which is because of that huge wave that came around the turn of the 20th century. But the earlier Jews who were here were more diverse in their background. Sorry, the second part of your question was where they settled. The oldest synagogues in the US today are in Charleston, Savannah, and in Providence, Rhode Island. They also settled in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, only on the Eastern Seaboard, though. Oh, that's terrific. Just for those on Zoom, he mentioned he's been to the Rhode Island Synagogue, which I would recommend visiting if you guys ever find yourselves in Providence. And if you don't want to go that far, come to Ketchum to see our synagogue. All right, thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure being with you today. And I'll stick around if anybody wants to chat or has questions.